easier to just go to the moon.
Look at the rebirth of our interest in returning to the moon with the Artemis program.
There's something about the moon that stirs the soul. Maybe it's the way it watches us from afar, silent, silver, unreachable. For decades, it was just that, a cold orb in the night sky, distant and lifeless. And yet we poured our hopes, fears, and ambitions into it. The moon became the mirror we used to measure our place in the universe. But now, after all these years, a new ripple has disturbed its silence. A revelation, a discovery that suggests we may never have truly known it at all. Neil deGrasse Tyson, a man not easily shaken by speculation, recently shared something that sent shockwaves through both scientific circles and the imagination of the public. It wasn't what he said outright, but what he didn't say. With his calm, deliberate voice, he painted a picture of something found, not just by accident, but perhaps hidden in plain sight. According to Tyson, it was China, not NASA, that finally unearthed a long-buried truth on the moon. Something structured, something out of place, something that could change everything. And that's when the silence surrounding the moon started to feel different. Not the stillness of space, but a kind of hush, like someone was keeping secrets. You see, the moon has always been a battlefield, not of war, but of pride, of ideology. During the Cold War, it was the high ground in a race not just for exploration, but for dominance. The Apollo missions, those brave steps and fluttering flags, weren't just scientific triumphs. They were political symbols. And then, almost as quickly as we had arrived, we left. We turned our gaze elsewhere. Missions slowed, funding dried up, stories faded. But some things never sat right. There were photographs, some blurry, some oddly framed. There were logs that seemed incomplete. And then there were the rumors, always dismissed, always ignored, that NASA had seen things up there that it never shared with the rest of us. Most people wrote them off as conspiracy. Who could blame them? But when China landed its Chang'e 4 rover on the far side of the moon, a place the world had barely touched, everything changed. They weren't just collecting soil or snapping pictures. They were digging, mapping, listening. And in that effort, they found something strange. Images began to emerge. Not blurry ones, clear, sharp, precise. Patterns etched into the regolith. Lines where no lines should be. Shapes too symmetrical, too purposeful. The kind of formations that made scientists sit up a little straighter and governments get a little quieter. That's when Tyson stepped in. He didn't declare alien life. He didn't shout cover-up, but he asked the question that no one in power wanted to answer. Why did it take China to show us this? Why was it never mentioned before? Could it really be that NASA, the agency that changed history with a single footprint, saw these anomalies first and chose silence? It's not about pointing fingers. It's about understanding what this all means. Because if those structures, yes, let's call them that, aren't natural, then someone made them. And if someone made them, then who and why? That's the edge we're standing on right now. Not just on the lip of a crater, but on the edge of something far bigger than we ever imagined the moon could offer. For the first time in generations, people are looking up not with nostalgia, but with curiosity, with hunger, wondering what lies just out of view, on the far side of that pale white guardian. And maybe, just maybe, wondering what lies beneath it. The moment China released those high-resolution images, the world felt something it hadn't felt in years. Suspicion, awe, and a strange kind of collective curiosity. It wasn't the pictures themselves that triggered it. It was what those pictures suggested. The clean lines, the perfect right angles, the texture of something that didn't look like it belonged on a lifeless rock suspended in the void. The images were real, verified, peer-reviewed in hushed conference rooms and late-night video calls between researchers who didn't know whether to be excited or terrified. And yet, none of them could explain how such symmetrical formations could appear naturally on the moon's far side, an area untouched by Earth's gaze, shielded from our transmissions, ignored by our own missions. How could NASA, with its decades of exploration and imaging, have missed this? Or worse, How could they have known and said nothing? Tyson didn't accuse. He didn't need to. All he had to do was raise the curtain just a little. Suggest without certainty that this wasn't new to everyone, that there were whispers during the Apollo days, moments when astronauts turned off public comms, when data was marked classified, when photographs were quietly stored and forgotten. Tyson didn't offer proof. He didn't have to. His reputation did the work. He offered a question, and that question refused to go away. For China, this was more than a scientific breakthrough. It was a declaration. They had gone where others hadn't. They had found what others hadn't or wouldn't admit to. In releasing the images, they weren't just informing the world. They were making a point. They were holding up a mirror to decades of secrecy and asking, "What else are you not telling us?" And suddenly NASA wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. You could feel the tension build, not just between nations, but within the scientific community itself. Researchers who had once depended solely on American data were now poring over Chinese reports, combing through pixels, comparing mineral compositions, magnetic anomalies, anything that might explain what the images showed. But the more they looked, the fewer answers they found. There was no volcanic process that could produce perfect geometric structures, no known impact event that could leave behind patterns with straight edges and reflective symmetry. And there, buried beneath the cold dust of the moon, was the one question no one could bury anymore. If these weren't natural, then what were they? The idea of artificial structures on the moon feels like something from a film, a plot device, a bedtime story for stargazers. But there they were, etched into the landscape like forgotten blueprints. Were they remnants? Signals? Artifacts? The possibility was no longer a fringe theory. It was a whisper in every observatory, a murmur in every space agency briefing. Something was there, and now everyone wanted to know why. But there was something else, something darker. Because if NASA had known, if these same structures were glimpsed during Apollo and shelved away, then the lie wasn't just about science. It was about trust, about who gets to decide what humanity should know. And that's what Tyson really challenged. Not just the evidence, but the silence, the years of quiet, the decades spent pretending there was nothing more to find. He didn't ask us to believe in aliens. He asked us to believe in questions, in the power of not knowing, and the danger of pretending we do. For Tyson, science isn't about having answers. It's about refusing to look away from the questions, no matter how uncomfortable they are. And right now, the most uncomfortable question of all is this: what's really up there? And why didn't we know until now? As the world leans closer to the moon with new eyes, there's a shift happening, not just in science, but in the very way we perceive our past. What was once celebrated as the golden age of lunar discovery now feels incomplete, like a story with the most important chapter torn out. And that void, that silence, is louder than ever. People aren't just curious anymore. They're restless. They're wondering why it took another country, half a century later, to point out what might have been there all along. China didn't just land a rover on the far side of the moon. They landed a challenge to the history we've been told, to the confidence we had in the narrative, and to the belief that everything worth finding had already been found. The formations near the South Pole Aitken Basin aren't towering monuments or glowing machines. They're subtle, intricate, almost shy in their presence. But that's what makes them more haunting, because they feel deliberate, placed, like fingerprints smudged on the glass of time. The more we study them, the less we understand. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the moon was never meant to give up its secrets easily. Neil deGrasse Tyson didn't come forward to create fear. He came forward to restore wonder, to remind us that discovery is not just about data, it's about humility, about accepting that no matter how far we've come, there are still mysteries we've barely touched. And in his calm, matter-of-fact tone, he left us with something far more powerful than answers. He gave us permission to be curious again. What if the moon was once more than just a satellite? What if it served a purpose long before we ever looked up at it? Some whisper it could have been a listening post, a beacon, or even a shelter, a relic of something far older than Earth. And while those ideas may sound fantastical, So once did the idea of walking on the moon itself. But Tyson didn't need to speculate. He knew all he had to do was highlight the silence and let the questions echo. Now other nations are mobilizing. India, the European Space Agency, even private companies, drawn not just by scientific ambition, but by the promise of being first to understand what that silence means. The race is no longer about flags or footprints. It's about answers, about truths we were never meant to forget. And in this new era, control of information has become more powerful than any flag planted in lunar soil. China has been careful, selective, strategic. They don't have to say what the structures are. They've already won by making us ask. If even a fragment of the moon's mystery is artificial, if even one corner of that shadowed surface holds evidence of non-human creation, then history is no longer ours alone to write. And every assumption we've ever made about life, about our uniqueness, about our place in the vast black sea above us, becomes fragile, breakable. But maybe that's not something to fear. Maybe it's a gift, because nothing brings us closer to truth than wonder. And in that moment, standing beneath the stars, staring up at a moon that suddenly feels alive with secrets, we are reminded of something ancient and beautiful. That the universe has always been bigger than us. And maybe, just maybe, we were never alone.